So as the sun goes down on Wednesday, those showers fade away. And then clear spells at first during the early hours of Thursday, but a lot of low cloud, mist and hill and coastal fog will start to creep back in to many places. So frost-free start again on Thursday, but once more, a gloomy start for many, a lot of that low-lying cloud around. Eventually it will lift, it will break up, the skies will brighten, and actually by Thursday afternoon, for many, it's looking like a fine day with sunny spells, and it's going to feel warm, even warmer on Good Friday for many, and most places dry.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates and strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to Brazier, fast-paced news from 4 until 6. I'm Alistair Stewart, covering for Colin today. One story dominates. The Mets confirmed that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are to be handed fixed penalty notices for breaching lockdown regulations. Can the two most senior politicians in the country be found to have broken the law and survive? Can the government that they lead survive? Have the opposition been handed a killer concoction? But are they up to capitalising on it? What do Tory MPs think? Many wanted the Prime Minister out, withdrew their threats, but only until the matter of these fixed penalty notices was resolved. And most importantly, what do you think? We've a pollster joining us, but I also want to hear directly from you via GB Views at GB News or on Twitter. We've heard many voices in the past, angry at being locked down, only to see our leaders and their staff live a different life. Has that anger abated, or will this refan the flames? Or has the Ukraine war and the praise heaped upon the Prime Minister by President Zelensky himself put all of this in a new context? Does the nation still care about who drank beer and ate cheese in Downing Street as Putin invaded and brutalised a nation? Well, intriguingly, as you may have heard if you were listening to our programmes a little earlier, Sir Roger Gale, MP, and Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Tories, both of whom had called for the Prime Minister to go as Partygate emerged, seem now to think that the Ukraine crisis has changed the situation. Both have stated on the record in the last few minutes that now is not the time to change the Prime Minister.
Very good afternoon. It's 4:02 and I'm Polly Middlehurst in the GB newsroom. And the top story today, Number 10 has confirmed the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, will both be fined over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and in Whitehall. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is calling for their resignations, saying they've broken the law and repeatedly lied to the public. The Prime Minister's wife, Carrie Johnson, is also set to receive a fine. Earlier, the Met Police said at least 30 new fixed penalty notices are being issued, bringing the total number to more than 50. Liberal Democrats leader Sir Ed Davey told GB News both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have to go.
I think a change of leadership now and consigning this failed Prime Minister and Chancellor to the dustbin of history would be a good move for our country. And what Liberal Democrats are calling for is for either them to go, or the Conservative MPs to do their patriotic duty for once, or for Parliament to be recalled. We have to have a change at the top.
Ed Davey. Well, to the United States now, where we have some breaking news for you. Several people have been injured in a shooting at Brooklyn subway station in New York. And a warning, the pictures we're about to show may be upsetting for some viewers. It seems shots were fired at the 36th Street station in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, with the New York Fire Department saying undetonated bombs were also found, and reports as well from New York City Police saying they're responding to reports of people wounded either by gunfire or an explosion. More details coming through all the time. We'll have more on that for you later. The UK has warned all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used in an attack on the besieged southern city of Mariupol yesterday. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss described any such action as a callous escalation in the conflict. The Armed Forces Minister James Heappey told GB News he's worried about a renewed assault in the east.
I'm concerned in that I think that the fighting that is going to happen this spring and this summer in the Donbass is going to be extremely violent and will be quite a big army on quite a big army. They clearly have the May the 9th victory parade in mind as a date by which they need to have achieved something.
Well, meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says thousands of his civilians have been deported from occupied regions and placed into what he's describing as filtration camps.
Documents are taken away from them, they are interrogated, humiliated. It is unclear how many people were killed. Many of those who were deported were sent across Russian regions. They are forbidden to leave. It is obvious that it is an attempt to get rid of witnesses of Russian war crimes committed in Ukraine.
President Zelensky. Meanwhile, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says attempts to isolate his country from the rest of the world will fail. Speaking in Russia's Far East, where he met his Belarusian counterpart, Vladimir Putin also said Moscow will never depend on the US and its allies again after they imposed crippling sanctions on Russia. He also repeated his country's ambitions in Ukraine, saying the military operation will achieve its goals. Here, the protest group Extinction Rebellion says they've used superglue, chains and bike locks to block the entrance to Lloyd's of London. 60 protesters have prevented staff from entering the insurance headquarters. The climate activists are demanding Lloyd's stop insuring fossil fuel projects. City of London police say no arrests have been made and they're working to facilitate peaceful protest. The number of people on payrolls in the UK rose by 35,000 between February and March. But the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics also show workers suffered the biggest fall in real pay for almost 9 years. Experts are warning wages are set to lag even further behind, with inflation expected to soar by the autumn. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says his plans for a windfall tax would help ease the cost of living crisis.
The thing that's coming up over and over again is people saying, I can't afford to pay my bills. What are you going to do about it? So the Labour Party says we're going to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea, profits they didn't expect to make because of the high global prices, use that to reduce energy bills by up to £600 for those that need it most.
Sir Keir Starmer. You're with GB News. More news as it happens. Now more from Alistair Stewart.
Pauline, thanks. Back now to our top story. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are to be fined over Downing Street parties. The Met Police says that officers have made over 50 referrals for fixed penalty notices following COVID breaches at Downing Street and indeed in Whitehall. They added there are large amounts of investigative material from which more referrals could still be made. Let's get more on that breaking story now and, as it were, go to the scene of the crime that Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak and many others have been issued with fines for breaches of COVID-19 regulations. Our political correspondent, there he is. Tom Harwood joins us live now from outside that bit of the wall between number 10 and number 11. It's not often that both get hit on the same day.
It certainly isn't a significant development in the Partygate row today. What we have seen, of course, is that several weeks ago what happened was senior civil servants and indeed some staff, some advisors, political advisors in the buildings behind me and indeed in Whitehall as well received the first 20 fixed penalty notices. And today, a further 30 plus, this time hitting elected representatives, hitting the Prime Minister, hitting the Chancellor and hitting the Prime Minister's wife. Certainly a different order of magnitude of story than when those first notices came about. But what's very interesting following what's happened just over the course of the last hour and a half or so is as much as what isn't being said as what is being said. Of course, we've heard comments from the Labour Party, from the Liberal Democrats, from other parties, from opposition MPs calling on the Prime Minister to resign. What we haven't heard, however, is many Conservative MPs calling for the same. As I speak at this precise moment, not a single fresh Conservative backbench voice calling for the Prime Minister to resign. It feels like there's a different temperature in Westminster now compared to several months ago. But interestingly, on the other side of things, we are yet to hear a Cabinet Minister make a statement in support of the Prime Minister either. What we are hearing at the moment is relative silence from the Conservative Party. Yes, some voices saying now is not the time. Indeed, some voices who were calling for the Prime Minister to go several months ago now saying now is not the time in the context of the Ukraine crisis, of course. However, the overwhelming response from the Conservative Party at this moment in time is silence. The Prime Minister, as I speak, is actually not in the building behind me. He's off at Chequers, having returned from Kiev just a day or so ago with that famous and indeed fairly brave walk around of the capital with President Zelensky, of course. Well, the Prime Minister is taking a day or two of rest with his family in Chequers. Indeed, of course, it's Easter this weekend. Parliament is in recess. And so ultimately what we are seeing is potentially less of the crucible of heat that was occurring when Parliament was sitting several months ago. And of course, Parliament doesn't return until midway through next week. So will the temperature rise when MPs start to coalesce, when those conversations in the corridors of power take place? Potentially. But for now, it seems like there is more of a lull than there was before.
Part of the reason for that, I'm sure, and we've both been through similar, though perhaps not quite as dramatic events as these over the years, Tom, is that both in number 10 and in number 11, they will be doing war games. they'll be working out what the best reaction might be strategically. In your view, with Angela Rayner saying that the PM has blown it and has lost his cover, and Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, already saying the country cannot be run by a criminal, have they shot their bolts early?
I think that it's hard for opposition politicians to have shot their bolts early, because ultimately this is what they were saying several months ago. Potentially what happened was the Labour Party demanded the resignation of the Prime Minister too soon, before the full Sue Gray report, indeed before that first fine that we now know has been demanded today by the Metropolitan Police. So potentially, if the Labour Party might have waited until this moment in time to demand for a resignation, we may well have seen a greater fever, a greater temperature. But yes, it does seem to be the case that the more opposition politicians demand the same thing, the less power potentially those demands now have. I suppose what happens now is we need to wait for this Metropolitan Police investigation to conclude. It's not over yet. Indeed, there may well be more fines coming down the line. There may well be more fines that affect senior individuals, senior politicians, senior civil servants, senior advisors, both in the building behind me and, of course, in the events in Whitehall that were being investigated as well. The Metropolitan Police currently saying they have not concluded their investigation, and only at the point at which they do conclude that investigation will Sue Gray's final report be able to be published. And once that's published, at that point in time, the Prime Minister has promised to come to the Commons to address everything that has been revealed out in the open once and for all. Potentially that is a crunch point that may well raise the temperature further. The other crunch point, of course, that the people in the buildings behind me will be considering in great detail is several weeks from now, the 5th of May, those local elections where communities right across England go to vote in various different localities, potentially most notably in London, where there are some big defences the Conservatives have to hold up. Will they hold Wandsworth Council? Will they hold Westminster Council? There are some big questions over those key swing areas. And indeed, if there's a drubbing for the Conservative Party on the 5th of May, if we find out going into the morning of the 6th of May, that Friday, if we have revealed a big rejection of the Conservative Party by the people of this country, well, potentially the political situation then gets more tricky. Potentially then the cover that is in effect given by international events and the serious nature of what is going on overseas, and indeed the warm reception the Prime Minister is receiving overseas, potentially that fades away.
Tom, stay exactly where you are. For those folk who are kind enough to be consuming our conversation and our programmes on radio, just to remind them that you are standing outside number 10 Downing Street with number 11, the Chancellor's official residence, just to your right. We've just been handed here a statement from number 10 Downing Street, which I'm going to read out, and I then want you to comment upon it. In the past minute or two, this is what number 10 have said, and I quote, "The Met Police have now explained that the fixed penalty notice issued to the Prime Minister will be in relation to the following incident. On the 19th of June 2020, at the Cabinet Room, number 10 Downing Street, between 2 and 3 p.m, you participated in a gathering of 2 or more people indoors in the Cabinet Room at number 10 Downing Street. Full stop. That's it." Pinpoints the event, gives the detail, explains the offence, i.e. there were more people there than there should have been, and that it was indoors. That's all they've said so far. Your thoughts?
Well, Alistair, this is an incredibly significant development, and it's incredibly significant because this 19th of June 2020 event is one of those that was the most eye-raising to have been reported latterly in this round of Partygate reports, because this was an event that was reported actually back in June 2020. On the 20th of June 2020, the Times newspaper added colour to a story it was reporting about the tough work that the Prime Minister was doing. It reported in the pages of the Times newspaper 2 years ago that the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor cut into some birthday cake in a brief bit of respite from the tough work they were doing to secure PPE supplies. Now, that is obviously a line that was at the time briefed to the Times newspaper by Downing Street. And if we take that piece of logic one step further, if back in June 2020, Downing Street saw it fit to brief that a gathering had taken place, a light-hearted one with cake, one with the Prime Minister and one with the Chancellor in the Cabinet room, if they briefed that to the Times newspaper 2 years ago, which they clearly did, that suggests that Number 10 did not believe that that event broke the rules. Indeed, they publicised that that event took place, and at the time it did not cause a stir. Not many people seemed to care. And yet what happened 2 years on from that was that in the context of Partygate, this event seemed to be much worse in the eyes of the public, and indeed has now elicited a fine for the Prime Minister, his wife and for the Chancellor. So really what we're seeing now is a difference of interpretation. Clearly at the time the Prime Minister did not believe that that event broke the rules, but the Metropolitan Police now believe that that event did break the rules. Why is that distinction important? Well, the Ministerial Code says that a minister may not lie to Parliament. Well, in Boris Johnson's mind, potentially he has not lied to Parliament. Potentially what Boris Johnson has said, in that saying he did not break the rules, is that he did not think he broke the rules, which clearly the Times report from the 20th of June 2020 reveals to us that that was the state of thinking within Number 10. It's an incredibly interesting incident that seems to have elicited this fine, because there seems to be that difference of interpretation well back 2 years ago in terms of what different parties to this event thought this event to be. A fascinating development in this story today.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. Stay exactly where you are. We will be conversing again, no doubt at all, as these 2 hours unfold. And we are with you here on GB News TV and radio right up until 6 o'clock with all of the very latest on this breaking story that both the Prime Minister and his wife and the Chancellor of the Exchequer have been given fixed penalty notices for breaching, we now know, the rules and regulations governing lockdown and our behaviour during lockdown on the 20th of June 2020 in the Cabinet Office. With me in the studio and for the remainder of these 2 hours, I'm delighted to say, is author and commentator Laura Dodsworth. Many people will know instantly when I say that name, but the backdrop is very, very clear. You've written a brilliant book on it as well. Your total opposition to lockdown as being something that disrupted society, disrupted the economy, was morally, constitutionally wrong. These are, as it were, minor episodes within that, but we now know that the PM said didn't break the rules, didn't happen. The police say did, guilty as charged, fixed penalty notice. I said to you before we came in, is it crisis time for the Prime Minister, or is it a storm in the teacup?
Yeah, it's a storm in a teacup. But just very quickly, my book's not actually about lockdown. It's about the behavioural science approach and the fear-mongering to make people follow the rules. But you did analyse my interpretation of lockdown correctly. No, I think this is really a hook for which people can hang their moral outrage. Look at the Labour Party and the Liberals already. I think you were absolutely right when you were talking to Tom there, that they have shot their bolts. The thing is, these fines now don't substantially alter the story that's gone before. We know there were parties at lockdown. I think we need to take a few steps back. What's actually wrong with these fines is they criminalised perfectly normal, banal, yet necessary and fundamental behaviour.
Yeah, although, as Tom Harwood pointed out, there's one crucial twist to it, and that is that it also proves that the Prime Minister did not tell the full, undiluted truth on several occasions, not least in the House of Commons. That, in some respects, is an even greater offence.
I agree with that. I think misleading Parliament is highly undesirable. We don't want that. I'm sure it won't be the first time. It should be judged in a bigger context. I think what's worse is the public were misled.
Yeah.
And to go back on why I'm saying that, everybody at Downing Street parties, all these breaches of rules that have led to the fixed penalty notices, they clearly didn't feel their lives were in peril. So the people closest to the data, the people closest to the scientists and SAGE and NerveTag and all the rest were quite happy to go to parties. They didn't feel like their lives were in danger.
Sure. And we were, just as you were talking, for people who are listening to us on radio rather than watching on television, we put up the other famous picture taken, we think, from a window. That's Allegra Stratton, who's the short-lived Prime Ministerial press spokesperson who joked about wine parties. But the image earlier than that was the one thought to have been taken from a top window in number 11, which showed people out on the patio, the veranda, socially distanced, but still clearly more than two of them. Take you back to something you said a few seconds ago, which in my mind is the absolute key to it, and that is what the public think. How it shows up in the opinion polls, whether they've become bored with it and moved on, have forgiven, or are still as cross and angry, as you say in the book, about being pushed around, bullied around by nudge-type policies. You will do this, you won't do that. It's entirely a democratic issue now.
Do you know, I think how people feel about this is going to depend on whether they had a fixed penalty notice, what they missed out on themselves if they were following the rules. There's a gym owner in Wales who's facing £56,000 of fines and costs for opening his gym. His gym is about fitness.
Yeah.
Is that more or less serious than having a slice of birthday cake? People had fines for having cups of tea with their neighbours, for sitting on park benches and for picnics. Basically, we criminalised completely normal human behaviour. I would say people probably have moved on, and when it comes around to the next general election in 2024, people won't care about this. What they will care about is the cost of living crisis.
I don't disagree with that either, Laura. Interesting. That point about the cost of living crisis. Stay exactly where you are. We've asked you if you'll be with me for the whole 2 hours of the programme, and I'm delighted that you are. Joining me now, not in the studio, but down the line, is Mo Hussein. Mo's former special advisor to Amber Rudd, MP, when she was both Home Secretary and indeed Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. And Amber, of course, famously said that Boris Johnson was a great guy to party with, but not someone that she'd necessarily want to have driving her home from said party. Mo spent 4 years in the Prime Minister's communications team at number 10 Downing Street as well, when Theresa May was the Prime Minister. Deep breath, Mo. What's going on in number 10 and indeed number 11 right now?
Well, there will certainly be elements of wargaming, different eventualities. This is one fine. There were several events that the Prime Minister's attendance potentially being investigated for. There could be more fines. So they'll be trying to look at what the damage of this will be over the long term. They'll be probably breathing a sigh of relief that it is the Easter recess. MPs aren't easily able to group and discuss and look at their options. The flip side of that being that they're with their constituents and they will hear more directly from people who feel very strongly about this. So that might be a saving grace somewhat for the Prime Minister and his team. And then they'll be looking at what the Prime Minister is doing just this weekend. These pictures of him walking around Kyiv with President Zelensky and what's happening on the world stage. And they'll be thinking, is that going to be the game changer here in terms of will MPs consider being unhappy about this, but is the Ukraine war the bigger issue, and does that keep the Prime Minister in position a bit longer?
Does it surprise you that both Sir Roger Gale, who was one of the early authors of a letter to the chair of the 1922 committee saying we need a vote of confidence, lost confidence in the Prime Minister, but also Douglas Ross, the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, a really important and quite senior player, have already come out and said, no, now is not the time to change?
It is a bit surprising because these people were very vocal about how they felt, and they moved very quickly on this. And I'm not sure that this line will hold over the next few days, because the public, yes, of course, feel very strongly about the Russian war in Ukraine, and they want the UK to be leading the way in terms of helping. And I believe that the government has done really well on that. But you can have that view and you can still think that breaking the rules that you yourself have put in place is wrong, and you can have a different view on that. And I think when MPs hear more from their constituents over the coming days, and if there are more revelations, there are more fines, there are more pictures coming out of what happened, then that tide could turn. of course, you have to also remember the wider backdrop here, which is local elections are coming up in 3 to 4 weeks. Who would want to instigate or be the first to call for a change right now when things are already looking quite precarious for the government in terms of issues like dealing with the cost of living? This would add a whole other layer of complexity, and people would really question, well, who are they actually voting for in these local elections?
Yeah, absolutely fascinating and important point about testing the water with your constituents as well. That really does matter, and it moved the weather during this crisis on several occasions as things unfolded. Now, I was very honest with folk. You worked for the Tory party at the very top. You worked with Theresa, you worked with Amber and others. But your professional view, if you were whispering in this Prime Minister's ear right now on Angela Rayner saying that his defence is now out of the window, and Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, saying the country cannot be run by a criminal, close quotes. Will they be rubbing their hands and think that Angela and Ed have gone a little bit too far, or have both of them actually touched a nerve?
I don't think they will think they've gone too far. This is what you would expect from the opposition, and the opposition have been saying this for quite a while, and they will be looking at the ministerial code, which is quite clear that if you have misled Parliament, and remember, we did hear a lot of, there's nothing to see here, all the rules were followed, there were no parties, which has now led to several investigations and these kinds of sanctions coming from the police. So they have said this for a while, they will continue to say this. The question really is how many Tory MPs, which they're the ones who matter, they're the audience the Prime Minister is trying to get the support of, how many of them say this, and how does this cut through in terms of public opinion? Again, we haven't spoken about Partygate for several months, understandably so, because of the horrific atrocities we're seeing in Ukraine, but this is still a live domestic issue as well, and this is not even the end of it, which is just one fine we're hearing about. We've still got to get the full report from both the police and from Sue Gray. There could be much more to come on this. Yeah. And when you go back to this drip, this is the thing that annoys MPs the most. Just when you think you know everything, you've answered every question to your constituents, there's something that blindsides you, and that is what erodes goodwill.
OK, Mo Hussein, always a pleasure to see you, and thank you very much indeed. And I just say that people who've been listening to our conversation for the last 5 minutes know Mo used to work for the Conservative Party at the very top. He worked with Theresa May and Amber Rudd, but I hope you'd agree with me that those were very straight, objective answers on what's going on within the Conservative Party in number 10 and 11, but also within the Labour Party as well. Mo, keep in touch. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
If you've just joined us here on GB News TV and radio, let me bring you right up to date what we know so far. The Prime Minister and his wife and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are all to be fined over Downing Street parties. How will that revelation that the two top politicians in the nation breached the law affect the opinion polls? We now know that we're talking about a specific event on the 20th of June 2020, which, as Tom Harwood said, was openly admitted, briefed to the newspapers even. They obviously thought it was no big deal. Gavin has sent us an email saying Ukraine has proved Johnson's capable of being statesmanlike. Context for the fine needs to be understood. Was it a party or was it just 5 minutes of happy birthday, Prime Minister? I doubt Tory MPs will no confidence Boris at the time, as they have no alternative. Well, there's an interesting twist at the end of Gavin's comment. Keep those comments coming in. gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me or GB News directly. My next guest is Head of Political Polling at Opinion Research. That's Chris Curtis. Always a pleasure to see you, Chris. Both Laura and I were saying earlier on, and I think Tom Harwood underlined it, is that the most important jury, as it were, in this entire affair is not the Metropolitan Police, with all due respect to them, and it's not actually people like Mo who are the strategists in the background. It's Joe and Joanna Public who will determine all of this. Has someone already commissioned a poll overnight to see how they feel about it?
We are in field as we speak, Alistair. We're currently surveying the views of the British public, and we'll have results out later this evening on whether, for example, they think the Prime Minister should resign in response to the fines from Metropolitan Police. But I mean, there's quite a lot, to be honest with you, that we know already. Polling has shown that the public were at least pretty fed up with what happened here. 6 in 10, roughly, say that they think the Prime Minister should resign over what happened. More people think that the moon landings were faked than think that the Prime Minister is telling the truth about what happened over Partygate. And there is increasingly a feeling among the public that this issue is a little bit of a distraction from more important events. People are increasingly telling us that in the polls. But regardless of that fact, it still had quite an impact on the reputation of both the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party.
Fascinating, because also you guys importantly keep trends. You watch, as you were just implying there, what folk felt before the war in Ukraine started and Russia invaded 6-7 weeks ago, the cost of living crisis, those taxes kicking in, all of the rest of it, those factors all tickle along. But I want to repeat this to you because I don't want me or our listeners and viewers to get it wrong. You're saying that there's already recent evidence in recent polling that the public have begun to move on because of Ukraine.
That was certainly true. But I mean, look, I suppose my way of thinking about all of this is that in a year's time, the biggest debate in this country is going to be the cost of living crisis and how the government is responding to that. It's a very difficult issue for the government to respond to because no matter how much they do, it's never going to be enough for people. And it's the kind of issue where people tend to trust Labour a little bit more than the Conservatives to start off with. So they're facing this really big issue that's affecting the lives of most people, if not everybody, in this country. Now, going into that, they need to be fighting fit, battle strong, have the trust of the British public. And Ukraine has helped a little bit at restoring the faith of the Prime Minister. But to be honest, they're going into this massive crisis having lost the trust and having lost the faith of the British public. And I think that means that if whether or not the Prime Minister survives this, I think he probably will, it's going to be a very tough year for the Conservative Party because people are going to be poorer, and they're not sure that the Prime Minister, given how he responded to Partygate, is the best man to the job and the best man to handle any issue anymore.
All right, we'll look forward to reading. I love that expression you used at the beginning of our conversation. We are in field right now with your clipboards and online and asking people. Let's chat about what the results of those surveys are. And we'll watch it with great interest. For the time being, Chris Curtis, always a pleasure to see you, and thank you very much indeed. So Chris Curtis there. Ellie has sent me a message saying, honestly, I'm so fed up with all of it. I'm more worried about other stuff than whether somebody was ambushed with a cake for a birthday. And Henry says, it's not glorious in any way being drummed up by envious, bitter, small-minded people pretending that there is a suitable replacement for Boris. If it gets to a membership vote, we will back Boris, says Henry. But it is a storm in a teacup. Keep those opinions coming in, whether you agree with that or have a different view. I'm intrigued to know. You're watching Alistair Stewart here on GB News TV, radio, online and digital radio as well. We'll have continuing coverage of the bombshell news from the Met that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are both to receive fines over lockdown-breaking parties. Much more to come, but first let's bring you right up to date with all of the latest news, including that. Here's Holly Middlehurst.
Alistair, thank you. Well, as you've been hearing, the Prime Minister will be fined over a lockdown-breaking gathering that took place in the Cabinet Room at number 10 Downing Street. The Metropolitan Police say the event took place for an hour on the afternoon of the 19th of June 2020, and the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the Prime Minister's wife will also be fined over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. Liberal Democrat leader Sir Ed Davey told GB News both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have to go.
I think a change of leadership now and consigning this failed Prime Minister and Chancellor to the dustbin of history would be a good move for our country. And what Liberal Democrats are calling for is for either them to go or the Conservative MPs to do their patriotic duty for once, or for Parliament to be recalled. We have to have a change at the top.
Davey. Well, in other news today, in the United States, several people have been shot and at least 13 injured at a subway station in New York. The shootings happened during the morning commute at 36th Street Station at Sunset Park in Brooklyn. Fire officials originally said undetonated bombs were found, but police say there are no active explosives on the scene. Investigations are ongoing. The UK has warned all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used in an attack on the besieged southern city of Mariupol. That comes after the Foreign Secretary described any such action as callous and an escalation of the conflict. Those are the latest news headlines on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+ on GB News. We'll have more from Alistair Stewart after the break.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity. That's the question. That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's 21 minutes to 5 and you're with Alistair Stewart on GB News, on TV, online and on digital radio. And we're continuing our rolling coverage of the news that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are both to receive fines for lockdown-breaking parties. The Metropolitan Police announced that a little earlier. Just before we went for the break, we were talking to Chris Curtis, who's a pollster. And if you remember rightly, at the very beginning of our coverage, I was suggesting, and I think Laura was going along with it, or maybe Laura suggested it and I went along with it, that perhaps you out there are more concerned about the cost of living crisis, or perhaps even Ukraine, but certainly cost of living crisis. Your eyes lit up when Curtis said the same, and he's a pollster.
Yes, when Chris Curtis said the same, it was me actually, Alistair.
Yeah.
Yes, the cost.
And I agree with you.
Yeah. Come 2024, everyone's going to care more about the cost of living crisis. Look at the French elections, Le Penomics. I have to say, a lot of Marine Le Pen's economic policies were pure genius. Now, what is an economic populist tide going to look like here? I think we'll find out by 2024. People aren't going to care about the birthday cake. They're going to care about how they can afford to pay for their bills.
Let me butt in, because this is absolutely upon
But
your feet.
I'm on a roll.
No, you are on a roll, but this will give you another little boost on the roll. Sam has sent me a message saying there are far more important reasons for Boris Johnson to resign. And I'm not going to try and interpret what Sam means by that in terms of the issues, but there's greater anger, it seems to me, out there about rising energy prices are going to go up again in October. Petrol pumps still not full up, despite cuts left, right and centre. That's what's really firing folk up.
Of course, it's going to be what hits people's pockets. It's going to hit their lives the hardest, much more than... I mean, this is a storm in a teacup by now. Partygate is now old news. The fines themselves don't substantially alter the stories. As you say, energy prices are going to go up. But that's only part of it. What's caused the cost of living crisis? Well, we know that real wages have gone down in the last quarter. Inflation is going to continue to go up. I think our inflation is about a percentage point higher than France, actually, at the moment. And what is that due to? Well, a big contributing factor is lockdown and the quantitative easing. Now, it's very easy for the opposition to have the moral courage to say the parties were wrong, we shouldn't have criminals in charge of the country. And it's much harder to find the reflection and the moral courage to say, well, perhaps lockdown was wrong, perhaps closing schools was wrong, perhaps making businesses run at half-mast for 2 years was wrong.
Final point on that, though, another thing that Chris Curtis said, which I picked up upon, bearing in mind what you'd said earlier, and you've just repeated it, is that in the longer term, beyond the 5th of May, whenever the general election is going to be, probably May or October 24, still a fair old way to go, then the philosophy of lockdown and the idea of telling people what to do or nudge them what to do, which you have written about, and I accept that correction from earlier on, that may linger. If things have got better economically, that may still linger.
Well, absolutely, because the government will still be nudging. Nudge hasn't gone anywhere.
Fascinating. We shall watch with great interest. My next guest this afternoon is... Sorry, that was Laura Dodsworth, author and commentator. We're talking about whether Boris Johnson, who was one of the chief architects of Brexit and certainly was the man who implemented it, kept his core support throughout this crisis. Many people view attacks on him as attacks on Brexit. Well, my next guest is Dr. Alan Wager, who's research associate at UK in a Changing Europe. Good to see you. This is really along the lines of what Sam messaged and that Laura and I were just talking about, that there are other issues on Boris Johnson's front, as it were, that may prove more tricky. He's now appointed Jacob Rees-Mogg as the delivery Secretary of State for getting Brexit done. There are a lot of people out there who are happy that it's gone through, but there's much more vocal criticism from those who are saying it's an absolute disaster, it's dreadful, it's not been enacted. That is going to be a real problem for him going forward.
So, yeah, what we've seen over the last sort of 6 months, if you like, is Boris Johnson's lost support quicker from Leave voters than he has from those remaining Conservative voters who backed Remain in 2016, because a lot of Leave voters are more likely to be the sort of people that don't necessarily have as much trust in MPs and so on, trust in government, wanted the system to be shaken up, and they were disappointed by the way that the Partygate story unfolded. So that was part of the dynamic that saw Boris Johnson lose support quicker amongst Leavers than amongst Remainers. But on the other hand, as we go into these elections in May, you know, I think that the general consensus based on these headlines that it's going to be a really, really bad night for the Conservative Party and for Boris Johnson may do him quite a lot of favours. And there's plenty of reasons to think, looking at the sort of the landscape of what's up for the contest in a few weeks, to think actually the headline, the actual results when they come in could give Boris Johnson a bit of a boost. Won't be the sort of whitewash that we've seen from governments in the past as they're sort of dying. I think that actually the results will be a bit more complicated than that in a few weeks.
Of that I have absolutely no doubt at all. Never ever believe anyone who tells you anything's ever going to be a whitewash. It's all utter nonsense. It never happens. Thank God for the privacy of the ballot box. But I'm going to take you back to one thing, and Angela Rayner, for better or for worse, touched upon it and said that the Prime Minister has now lost his lines of defence, courtesy of the Metropolitan Police. And one of the longer-running problems that this Prime Minister does have to address is his relationship with the truth and with candour and telling it like it is. And in your area of expertise, you know, an oven-ready Brexit, ready to go, the economy will be brilliant. Messages from the Overseas Trade Department saying they're still trying to put together a trade deal with the Americans, which will involve cutting deals with individual states rather than a clear-cut singular deal. There is a very powerful argument that says he's got to come clean on what he can and can't do and get on and then deliver it. Otherwise, those Leavers who switched and gave him seats behind the red wall going to go back to Labour.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we always thought was when Boris Johnson got into trouble in this parliament, he could reach for the lever mark Brexit, perhaps try and ramp up tensions regarding the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example. Well, while Ukraine has given Boris Johnson some political safety in terms of this Partygate scandal, it's also made it a lot more difficult to try and ramp up any tensions between the UK and the European Union to try and resolve, as you might see it, this Northern Ireland Protocol issue. So the issue of Brexit is a lot more difficult to play for Boris Johnson now, and that was something that he might have thought that he could reach for in the wake of the Partygate scandal. And for example, you saw there was one of these sort of, I said, storm in a teacup things a couple of weeks ago, where he compared Brexit to the struggle in the Ukraine. Some people argued he's quit. So that, for example, was him trying to reignite the Brexit debate, try and remind his voters that backed him in 2019 that he is their guy. And he wasn't their guy necessarily because he told the truth the whole time, but because he was perceived to be someone that got things done and indeed got Brexit done. So I think that was key, and that's what he needs to try and think about if he's trying to get back on track now, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Alan Wager, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Dr. Alan Wager, who's the Research Associate in British Politics, UK in a Changing Europe. Laura Dodsworth is still with me, I'm delighted to say, and was listening intently to that. Yeah. I wanted to come back to you just for a quick comment. I mean, you can comment specifically on the Brexit agenda if you want, but it seemed to me that what Alan was saying there played more to what's been our joint theme as the programme's unfolded, and that is there are many other areas where, however much difficulty the Prime Minister is in right now today, that he can reach into and do better upon, whether it's cost of living, Brexit, Europe, and actually do better.
Absolutely. I think Angela Rayner is going to look a bit silly, to be honest, for having spoken out quite so harshly about him today. Look, I'm not his personal champion, but this is just Boris bashing. Now, I do want to say something about Angela Rayner and the rest of the Labour Party, because it's all very well to speak up now because they want fines to be slapped on people for going to parties at Downing Street. But where were they speaking up for ordinary people, working class people and disadvantaged people when these fixed penalty fines were actually set? Now, fixed penalty fines are normally £100, £200, maybe you get £100 for distracted driving. Fines went up to £10,000 during lockdown. They were horrific. Now, if you left self-isolation recklessly, the fine was £4,000. And bearing in mind, that didn't mean you infected anybody who did anything, it just means you left your house. And a designated person, a police officer could say you'd done it recklessly and your fine would be £4,000. Now, we have to go back to the 9th century for fines that hefty to have been heaped upon people. But in the 9th century, your crime would have been perhaps killing a non-prospering Welshman. We really haven't had fines like this since the blood money or the Weregild of the Dark Ages. Yeah. These fines were designed to break households, to inflict the fear of God into people's hearts. And it was just outrageous to do this to people for what was basically normal human behaviour. Yeah. And Labour said nothing about it.
Interesting. We're going to go to Tom Harwood in literally 20 seconds, but I've got to share with you what Oliver's sent to me. If we thoroughly investigated every member of Parliament for every party in Parliament over COVID breaches and made those guilty resign, I wonder how many MPs we'd be left with.
Well, it's a good point. And probably lots of people in the media too. Let's not forget, do you remember Beth Rigby and Kay Burley? They had a birthday party, didn't they? Did I get that right? Was it a birthday party, a dinner?
I had a message from somebody who described it as a pub crawl, which I think is probably harsh. I think it was a birthday party, and I think she apologised. And to be fair, we always try and be fair in these matters, she was suspended for some considerable time by John Riley, who's the guy I used to work with when I was ITN, who now runs Sky. So there were elements of folk attending things that perhaps they ought not to have done. Laura, we're going to park it there for a moment, but stay with me right up until 6 o'clock, if you'd be so kind. I'm delighted to be rejoined, there he is, by our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who, as requested by my good self, is still there live in Downing Street for us. Tom, do you have breaking news for us, or developments, or merely the reflections of Harwood upon what my other guests have been saying?
A temperature check for you, Alistair, today. It seems that the Conservative backbenchers, those people who really determine the future of the Prime Minister, are holding steady, holding fire, despite some considerable pressure from the benches opposite, from those opposition parties. Interestingly, in the last few moments as well, the Prime Minister has finally released a statement. A statement, however, that does not cover anything to do with Partygate, No, it was updating the world on a phone call he had with President Biden of the United States of America. In a tweet, Boris Johnson told the British public that he's just got off the phone with President Biden and that he updated Biden on his conversations with President Zelensky of Ukraine over the weekend. Attached to it was a photograph of Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky walking the streets of Kiev. A clear, if not so subtle message that this is what the Prime Minister is focusing on as this media storm rolls on, that potentially there are more important matters overseas that the Prime Minister is focused on. And no doubt this is someone who has won plaudits for his stance in regard to the Ukraine issue. The United Kingdom has been at the forefront of a lot of the international action on this issue and indeed continues to push the European Union to go further on sanctions, for example, on the SWIFT international banking system. The United Kingdom does seem to be more aligned with Ukraine on those issues, and this is something that the Prime Minister is not so subtly highlighting to the world today as this storm over parties 2 years ago resurfaces. The only other slight interesting point to maybe raise in this conversation, which is something that has been circulating on Twitter a small bit, was looking at this particular event, a birthday cake in the cabinet room with people who were together earlier for a work meeting. Is it really so different from potentially nurses who filmed a TikTok dance on a break in a hospital? Teachers, perhaps, who opened a glass of wine in the staff room after a day of work? Was what happened in the building behind me really that different to what
Let me butt in simply to say precisely the point that Laura Dodsworth was making here live in the studio, and that Chris Curtis, the pollster, also said, really, whatever happens, and I find it amusing that over your left shoulder right now, there are people, as they always do when they get to come into Downing Street, not like you and me who go there occasionally to work, they still want to be photographed standing in front of the black door, whoever occupies it. But Dan has sent me in a message that I think plays to your breaking news that Boris Johnson has confirmed that he's been on the telephone to the President of the United States of America and again exchanging messages and images with Zelensky of Ukraine. Dan messages to say, are we honestly going to bring down a Prime Minister over a party? There is a war in Europe, the biggest since World War II, and we're talking about this like we've gone nuts. The country has gone mad. That's what Dan has to say, Tom.
It's certainly a view, and it's one that is persuasive. It seems to be persuasive amongst the constituency here that matters, at least for now, which is, of course, backbench Conservative MPs. They're the only people who can remove or otherwise the Prime Minister. And it's really their decision that matters. If they believe that the war is more important, which is clearly implicitly the message that the Prime Minister is putting out in that tweet he issued in the last few minutes, well, if they believe that to be the case, the Prime Minister is safe for now. However, on the other side of things, what many opposition politicians will cite is the fact that there have been wars in the past and changes of prime ministers within them. In 1940, of course, Neville Chamberlain was turfed out and replaced by Winston Churchill. That was in the middle of a war. Indeed, in the First World War as well, there was a change of prime minister, and right at the end of the Second World War as well, before VJ Day, there was a general election in the United Kingdom and Winston Churchill himself was removed as prime minister. Now it's for history to judge whether or not that was a particularly wise move on behalf of the people of the United Kingdom, but certainly there have been prime ministers who have been removed in the middle of wars before. But ultimately, it's not really for anyone other than Conservative backbenchers to decide now what happens to the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, and Churchill came back in the 50s, but didn't last terribly long. Final point to you, we've rightly been focusing on Boris Johnson because he's the Prime Minister, First Lord of the Treasury as well, but the neighbour over your right shoulder was already in what most objective commentators agreed was fairly serious difficulties over his green card and his commitment to this country as opposed to the United States of America, harking back to his banking days, and to his wife's tax affairs and offshore trusts and all the rest of this, the non-dom status. Are we missing the point that Rishi Sunak is potentially in greater difficulty as a result of all of this than Boris Johnson?
Well, potentially the situation of Rishi Sunak, who seems to have gone from hero to zero in the matter of weeks, seems to be, if anything, securing the position of the Prime Minister. The fact that this new potential for a Conservative election contest would be a very unpredictable one. It wouldn't be a straight swap for an unpopular Prime Minister for a popular Chancellor. That prospect is out of the window now, and a much more unpredictable contest may arise. Indeed, there were some reports that Rishi Sunak was considering his own position even last week, even before this announcement of new fixed penalty notices for both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister has been announced today. Whether or not we can read too much into those briefings, who those briefings indeed have been coming from, whether these are nefarious noises from opponents of the Chancellor or indeed genuine soundings from friends, remains to be seen. But certainly Rishi Sunak has been having a tougher time of it as Chancellor in the last week or so compared to the previous 2 years. Of course, this is someone who was thrust into the political spotlight relatively recently. He'd only just entered the cabinet at the time of the 2019 general election and then was thrust into the spotlight again as Chancellor just a couple of months after Boris Johnson won that historic victory in December 2019. Of course, he became a very popular Chancellor, doshing out the money as he liberally did throughout the start of that pandemic. Now, however, with the consequences of high inflation, of higher taxes, of course, to claw some of that money back, the consequences of paying for all of that spending seem to be a lot less popular. Is it all that fun to be Chancellor when you have to be Mr. Parsimonious as opposed to Mr. Benevolent? Potentially not so.
Harwood, always a pleasure. Stay where you are, and we'll come back to you again, I'm sure, several times before I go off air and hand the baton over to the next team at 6 o'clock. If you are just joining us here on GB News TV and radio, let me remind you of our top story. The Prime Minister and his wife, Carrie Johnson, as well as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, already under fire, as I was just saying to Tom there, over tax arrangements, are to be fined over Downing Street parties. The Metropolitan Police says that officers have made over 50 referrals for fixed penalty notices over COVID breaches at Downing Street and in Whitehall. They added that there is a large amount of investigative material from which more referrals could still be made. But that's where we sit right now. Conservative commentator and former advisor to John Major, Joanne Nadler, joins me live now. Joanne, great to see you. Saw you at the weekend, and thank you very much indeed for risking all and coming back on board. I mean, when you were working with John and other team, talking to Mo Hussein earlier on about the ups and downs that Theresa May went through, cast your mind back to the trickiest moments you and the team working with John faced. What do you sense is likely to be going on in Number 10 or across at Chequers right now?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last few months is Boris Johnson playing a very canny long game and actually not responding to any of the many calls for him to resign or even to sort of come clean exactly about what did go on and when exactly. And I think you're quite right in a way to look back to the Major government, because what was so very damaging for the Conservative Party was this kind of long and painful decline that went on pretty much from the moment he was re-elected in 1992 until the point that it became inevitable that Labour would take over. So I think the question facing Conservative MPs is not so much what happens in the immediate couple of days, but where they see the party in 2024 approaching another election and who they feel will be, the most suitable person to take them into that election.
Yeah. And as I was just saying to Tom Harwood, in a sense, it's almost Machiavellian, because potentially the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who already faced difficulties in his own right, green cards, and via his wife over her tax arrangements and non-dom status, a lot of the heat could be taken away from Number 10 and focused on Number 11. Laura and I were just saying that in some respects, most people listening to these conversations, Joanne, are much more concerned about the cost of living crisis than they are about Cakegate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so they should be. I mean, I wouldn't want to sort of diminish the genuine, I think, anger that there was when the stories about Partygate first came to light, because as Laura has so effectively highlighted, people were not allowed to live their normal lives. And more information that's come out subsequent to the sort of the closing of lockdown, as it were, or the reopening, suggests that, you know, really those policies weren't altogether effective, even in terms of controlling the virus, let alone what it's done to the economy. So I think, you know, there is a reason for people to look at this and feel genuinely furious about it. But context is all, I think, in politics. And the context is very different now to even what it was when these stories first came to light. And absolutely, people will be far more concerned about who is going to do a better job at improving their well-being and their quality of life and their economic situation. Now, they may conclude that it's not Boris Johnson and he may get a terrible drubbing at the polls in May, in which case I think, you know, the party will obviously be going through this process, as I say, of reviewing who's the best person to take them into the next general election. And, you know, Boris Johnson has an amazing capacity for bouncing back, and they still may conclude that there's no one better than him, particularly in view of the fact that the person that most people were touting as being the next leader is now probably not in the game anymore.
Absolutely fascinating view there, Joanne. A real pleasure always to talk to you. His capacity to bounce back, I agree, is extraordinary, as is, however, and you know this better than I do, the Conservative Party's capacity to hang, draw and quarter its leaders when they think the time has come. We shall watch this with great interest. Thank you very much indeed, Joanne. Stay in touch and look forward to talking to you again. The time is 2 minutes past 5. You are watching GB News, TV and radio. We'll be continuing our coverage over the next hour, but first let's bring you right up to date with the very latest news on that top story and the rest of it.
Very good afternoon to you. As you've been hearing, Downing Street says the Prime Minister is going to be fined over his birthday party, which was held during lockdown on the 19th of June 2020. We understand the Met Police say the lockdown-breaking event took place for an hour in the Cabinet Room at number 10. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the Prime Minister's wife will also be fined over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. Labour MP for Bury South, Christian Wakeford, who defected from the Conservatives in January, says it's a sad day for politics.
What we've got instead is a Prime Minister who doesn't respect his own office, doesn't respect Parliament, doesn't respect the general public, because he's lied to all of them. So I think it's about time that the Prime Minister just resigns and takes his Chancellor with him. Unfortunately, I don't think he's going to do that.
Breaking news in the United States. Several people have been injured in a shooting event at Brooklyn subway station in New York. And a warning, the pictures we're about to show may be upsetting for some viewers. CNN are reporting 8 people were shot and 16 more were injured. It happened during the morning commute at 36th Street Station, that's Sunset Park in Brooklyn. Fire officials originally saying there were undetonated bombs found, but police saying there are no active explosives. Suspicions there may have been a smoke device used in the attack. The whereabouts of the perpetrator, though, unclear at this stage. More on that as we get it. The UK has warned all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used in an attack on the besieged southern city of Mariupol yesterday. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss described any such action yesterday as a callous escalation in the conflict. The Armed Forces Minister James Heappey told GB News he's worried about a renewed assault in the east.
I'm concerned in that I think that the fighting that is going to happen this spring and this summer in the Donbass is going to be extremely violent and will be quite a big army on quite a big army. They clearly have the May the 9th victory parade in mind as a date by which they need to have achieved something.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says thousands of civilians have been deported from his country and placed in what he describes as filtration camps.
Documents are taken away from them, they are interrogated, humiliated. It is unclear how many people were killed. Many of those who were deported were sent across Russian regions. They are forbidden to leave. It is obvious that it is an attempt to get rid of witnesses of Russian war crimes committed in Ukraine.
President Zelensky. Well, Russia's president says attempts to isolate Russia from the rest of the world will fail. Speaking in Russia's Far East, where he met his Belarusian counterpart, Vladimir Putin also said Moscow will never depend on the United States and its allies again after they imposed crippling sanctions. He also repeated his country's ambitions in Ukraine, saying the military operation would achieve its goals. In the UK, 3 victims of grooming gangs in Rochdale have received substantial damages and a personal apology from Greater Manchester Police. Chief Constable Stephen Watson apologised for failings when the women were repeatedly raped and sexually abused by gangs of men as children. Police failed to record crimes, investigate offenders, collect intelligence or charge and prosecute abusers. It happened under previous chief constables, including Sir Peter Fahey and his predecessor. The protest group Extinction Rebellion says they've used superglued chains and bike locks to block the entrance of Lloyd's of London. 60 protesters have prevented staff entering the insurance headquarters today, saying they're demanding Lloyd's stop insuring fossil fuel projects. City of London police say no arrests have been made and they're working to facilitate peaceful protest. The number of people on payrolls rose by 35,000 between February and March, but the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics also show workers suffered the biggest fall in real pay for almost 9 years. Experts are warning wages are set to lag even further behind, with inflation expected to soar during the autumn. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says his plans for a windfall tax could help ease the cost of living crisis.
The thing that's coming up over and over again is people saying, I can't afford to pay my bills. What are you going to do about it? So the Labour Party says we're going to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea, profits they didn't expect to make because of the high global prices, use that to reduce energy bills by up to £600 for those that need it most.
Sir Keir Starmer. You're with GB News. More news as it happens, and Alistair's back after the break.
Polly, thank you very much indeed. A reminder of that top story, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are to be fined over Downing Street parties. How will the revelation that the 2 top politicians in the country breached the law affect the opinion polls? Do people care? And is the Labour Party strong enough to take advantage of the situation? You just heard the leader, Sir Keir Starmer, there in Polly's news bulletin, shifting the ground slightly to the cost of living crisis, which we've been talking about on this programme as well, and thus take advantage of the situation. And again, significant levels of support drawing in towards Labour. We shall see. The next general election might not be until 2024, maybe May, maybe October, but there are, of course, local elections coming up next month. Just before we cross live to Downing Street and get the very latest from Darren McCafferty there, I want to read out 2 other very quick emails because this is all about balance as well. We genuinely want to hear all sides of the argument. And Brian says, would you still feel that way, i.e. it's a storm in a teacup, is what I said, and Laura said it a little earlier on, if it was your son or your daughter being buried and you couldn't attend their funeral because the law said that you couldn't, would it not be a kick in the teeth? Do you not expect your Prime Minister to be truthful and have integrity? I expect both, therefore he must go. And finally, from Michael, it's about systematic law-breaking from the people who actually introduced the laws. It's about their continued misleading of Parliament on the issues and the contempt that they have shown the people of the United Kingdom. Keep those emails coming in, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. We genuinely want to hear. So, as promised, we can now cross to Downing Street and join our political editor, Darren McCafferty, who is there. Tom was standing where you were just a few moments ago and said that we've heard about conversations between Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and further communications twixt Boris Johnson and President Zelensky of Ukraine. Any other developments?
Well, I think we're going to hear from the Prime Minister himself. I think there's an expectation. He's not in Downing Street, by the way, Alistair. He is in Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, that he is likely to do an interview with the British press at some point later on today. I would expect we're probably going to hear I'm sorry from the Prime Minister, given the fact that he has been fined. I don't think what we're going to hear is any sense of resignation. As you say, the government have been pretty determined, really, since Partygate started in the revelations that they are focused on other, they would suggest, bigger issues such as the cost of living crisis and the war in Ukraine. That is not to say, though, that politically damaging for Boris Johnson and indeed for the Chancellor, as we said, Rishi Sunak as well. These were rules that were imposed on all of us by them, and yet, whether deliberately or by mistake, they have been found to have broken those rules by the police and are facing a fixed penalty notice. But there is a big difference from where we were just a matter of months ago in the heat of this scandal, when the Prime Minister's position genuinely seemed to be on the line. I think we're not there today, even though the story has taken this rather dramatic turn. And I say that because in many ways politics is about momentum, Alistair. There was a sense that there was a movement against the Prime Minister, even from within his own party at the end of January, start of February. The war, the dreadful war in Ukraine, has clearly put a stop to that, and the Prime Minister has got a lot more breathing space. And what is notable this afternoon is that even some of his harshest critics, like Sir Roger Gale, a senior Conservative MP, Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Andrew Bridgen, another MP from the Conservative Party who'd submitted a letter to Sir Graham Brady calling for a leadership challenge, they this afternoon are not calling for the Prime Minister to go. In fact, they're making the argument it would be the wrong time to change who is the leader of their party and indeed of the country. But as I say, it is still massively politically damaging. The Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, all effectively accusing the Prime Minister of lying, of misleading Parliament, of breaking the law, and calling for him to resign.
I was just reading the Bridgen stuff, playing the long game, and adds to what you've just said there as well. I think it potentially is a resignation issue, however, I think unlikely to be done at the moment, but I don't think he's going to lead us into the next general election.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, this, because you may feel that this is the end of the story, that, you know, the Prime Minister's faced a fine, he will apologise, there'll be a slap on the wrist, and he will move on. But this is not the end of the story. Partygate is far from over, in the sense that this fine relates to a birthday party, a surprise one, a party in which we were told by a senior minister, the Prime Minister was ambushed by a cake by his wife inside the cabinet room. That was widely reported at the time by the Times newspaper. Hardly anyone blinked an eyelid back then. But we didn't know back then the scale of the parties that were taking place in Downing Street and Whitehall, potentially up to 18, or that up to 50 people would be given fixed penalty notices for attending those parties. And I'd say it's not the end, because it seems that the Metropolitan Police are literally going through these parties individually. The one that related to 20 fixed penalty notices, that was in relation to the party that was held, that Boris Johnson was not at, in the basement of Downing Street on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. This one seems to be entirely in relation to that birthday party in the cabinet room. But as I say, there are allegations of up to a dozen more parties having taken place. It is possible the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, others may get fined in the future. We've also have to wait for Sue Gray's report, which again could be incredibly damaging for the Prime Minister. And to add to all of that, Alistair, there will be political consequences, not least at the local elections that are due to be held across the country on May 5th. So I think it's fair to say the Prime Minister in the short term will survive, but are there moments of danger ahead? You bet there are. And is this going to cause him lasting damage inside and outside his own party? You're damn right it will.
Darren, always a joy to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Keep those celebrated ears to the ground, and you come back and talk to us whenever you've got something fresh there. Darren McCaffrey there, our political editor, live for us in Downing Street. Very good friend of mine, Patrick O'Flynn, Telegraph columnist, former member of the European Parliament, I'm delighted to say joins me live now. Former political editor of The Express as well, I always think should be included in those battle honours, Paddy. Take a deep breath. Upon your experience, not the fact that you support the SDP or anything like that, but as your experience as a Telegraph columnist and an Express political editor, How much trouble do you think Boris Johnson's in? Storm in a teacup or fatal?
Well, I certainly think it's more than a storm in a teacup. And I was very interested in your earlier framing of it, Alistair, about the challenge for Labour, because I think Keir Starmer could sort of take us into Groundhog Week next week by getting hysterical and obsessive about the fine. And clearly there's a very large constituency of opinion that's appalled by Boris Johnson, but those people are never going to vote Conservative. And really, Starmer needs to concentrate on the swing voters, I think. And he needs to convince people now that he's not still got his lawyer's hat on, where he thinks he wins at politics through legal processology. His challenge now, in what looks quite propitious circumstances for him with the cost of living problem as well, is to use this undoubted further weakening of Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, the Tory brand, because there have been some very odd stories about Tory MPs in recent days, to use this to win big on May the 5th. Now, I think he does that by dressing it into a narrative about incompetence, chaotic goings-on and exaggerated entitlement. But I don't think if he goes the whole Guardianista hog hysterically in the Commons next week, I think he risks actually letting Boris Johnson off the hook. So I think it's a big week, a big fortnight, a big 3 weeks coming up for Keir Starmer. But I certainly agree with Darren McCaffrey, by the way, that I think it's sort of looking quite likely that the Prime Minister could be in for multiple fixed penalty notices, and that Carrie Johnson could too. It's hard to see if this birthday party, fairly innocuous, was deemed worthy of fixed penalty notices, that the so-called ABBA party held to celebrate the expulsion of Dominic Cummings won't be seen to clear that threshold too.
Our friends at The Spectator did a very good piece a couple of days ago saying that as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, the only potentially good thing to come out of Rishi Sunak being in difficulty is that you might actually end up with a more Thatcherite Chancellor of the Exchequer. Do you give any credence at all to this talk about there being a possible autumn reshuffle to really draw a big fat blue line under all of this?
I personally don't see that Rishi Sunak will take a different cabinet post if challenged by Boris Johnson to do so. I think he would walk rather than be kind of moved slightly downwards, I don't know, to become business secretary or something like that. So I don't really think that that's a likely thing. I don't think a cabinet reshuffle is particularly what the British public have in mind. I think they want to see the Conservatives start delivering on the cost of living, on energy, on the Channel dinghies, which GB News continues to lead the way, highlighting on lots of basic nuts and bolts things. And, you know, Labour has been going a bit for the law and order and crime situation. I think that's another issue of anxiety that's bubbling away. So, you know, Boris Johnson is a funny one as Prime Minister. He's capable of great highs, and I really do think he has performed very, very well. On the global stage over Ukraine, and he may get some credit for that. But in the end,
it's a weird truth, isn't it? From the very beginning of these 2 hours, and Laura Dodsworth, who you know very well, is in the studio with me as well. And all of my guests have been talking about cost of living. The majority of the emails that folk have been kind enough to be sending in is about the cost of living crisis. But here's the point, Paddy, and I'd love your reflections upon it, is that a senior politician who's in difficulty, but has a whole range of things, whether it's doing better on Brexit, whether it's doing better on the cost of living, on whatever it might be, better to have a palette from which you can paint than open the door and all the toys have gone.
Yeah, and I think Boris Johnson is still in the game, and I think it's, you know, 2 months ago, we were in a position, weren't we, where Conservative MPs, you know, getting on for, you know, half of them were really thinking of dropping Boris Johnson. And they thought they knew who the replacement would be in Rishi Sunak. And they thought he was a spare. He was a reliable person who could be counted on to beat Labour at an election. And I think Rishi Sunak thought that too. Hence, when he did his press conference after the Sue Gray exchanges in the Commons when Boris Johnson did the Jimmy Savile jibe at Keir Starmer. And Rishi Sunak, with the Prime Minister in big trouble, says, I wouldn't have said it. Now, to me, that was a bit of a nod and a wink to those insurrectionists to complete the job. Well, 2 months later, we're in an entirely different position, and Tory MPs do not know who they would end up with. And they do not know if they've got someone who can be relied on to beat Keir Starmer. They do know that Boris Johnson, as was said earlier, remarkable powers of recovery and a brilliant election campaigner, usually a winner in electoral politics. So I think that's as much as anything why at the moment they're sitting on their hands.
Paddy, always a pleasure, genuinely. Thank you very much for breaking into your afternoon and talking to us. See you very, very soon. 30 seconds, otherwise I'm going to be shouted at severely by the people outside. But you were listening, and I saw your little face light up on a couple of occasions with what Patrick Flynn was talking about, particularly on that agenda of other issues that need addressing and need addressing urgently.
They do, although that's what my face was lighting up. I was thinking about Keir Starmer and thinking he's so negative. He's always on the attack, and I think that...
But he's talking about the cost of living crisis. That's what he was just saying in Colin's news bulletin as well. And the windfall tax on the oil giants.
Yeah, if Keir Starmer had his way, it would have been locked down longer and harder. There'd have been more quantitative easing throughout all of it, and that would have been even more of a contribution to inflation and the cost of living. There would have been a nightmare. There isn't a magic money forest big enough for how Labour would have handled it. But you know what, instead of going on the attack, why isn't Keir Starmer talking about an amnesty? How about everyone who's been given a fixed penalty notice being let off? I mean, the idea that people... I have every sympathy with those people who sent you those passionate emails, because I do agree, nobody should have been denied attending a funeral or reaching out and hugging somebody at a funeral. It is a disgrace, and it is storing up post-traumatic stress for the future. I really think so. It was adding a terrible insult to injury. But you know what? Why isn't everybody who's been unfairly fined let off? Yeah. I don't think teenagers should be fined for takeaway Nando's, and elderly people shouldn't have been fined for a cup of tea in the kitchen with a neighbour.
So much more still to play for on that, as you say, and see how Keir Starmer and indeed Boris Johnson himself deals with it for the time being. Thank you very much indeed. Laura will stay with me for the rest of the programme. We've got another 38 minutes or so to go, and we'll give our final thoughts towards the end of it. And keep those emails coming in. You've been gems and thoughtful and reflective and balanced this afternoon. Love it. Have some more of that before the end of the programme as well, which is at 6 o'clock. Now, we've also been talking quite a bit so far, as indeed have you, about the war in Ukraine, the invasion by Russia of an independent state that we pledged our support to. Praise heaped upon the Prime Minister by President Zelensky himself. And has that put all of this in a different context? Does the nation still care about who drank a beer and ate cheese in Downing Street as Vladimir Putin invaded and brutalized a nation, and now plans, as we understand, from all sorts of people in the defence world, the political world and the diplomatic world, that it's just about to get a whole lot nastier in the Donbass down in the southeast region? Well, the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, Dr. Alan Mendoza, joins me. Alan, it's always a pleasure to see you there and get your wisdom on it. I don't want to ask you so much about whether or not what's going on in the Ukraine will save Boris Johnson's skin if he is in difficulty. Just park that to one side. But has he done enough up to now to be that man that Zelensky seemed to describe as the best thing since?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this conflict has brought out the best of Boris Johnson, and in a sense, it was set up to do that. It's an ideological battle. It's a classic war of aggression. It is a stage set for big gestures in a world full of little leaders. And Boris is, an outsized character, and he saw the conflict for what it was. He has led from the front with his chin, if you like, from day one. He has stated what is right and what is wrong, and I think he's getting the plaudits from President Zelensky for having done so in a much better way than any other Western leader. I think that's why he indeed has endeared himself so much to the Ukrainian president.
It's interesting as well that all of this stuff's got to be paid for, And there's normally a greater sensitivity in Conservative Party circles than there appears to be over this. Johnson saying to Zelensky, whatever you need, you can have it, whether it's tanks or mobile artillery, and brilliant illustrations over all of the newspapers this morning, or now upwards of £1 billion in direct economic aid. I'm paying for that. You're paying for that. My guests in the studio are paying for that. Getting away with it.
Well, getting away with it because it's so manifestly obvious that it is a war of necessity, not a war of choice. Putin foisted this war upon not just Ukraine, but all of us, essentially, by breaking international norms of behaviour. He's continued to do worse than that with the human rights abuses we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine. What he's done is an affront to the international community, to the world. It is something, of course, the British people completely understand we need to resist, within boundaries, of course. Nobody's suggesting that we are going to be putting troops on the ground as such. But short of that, anything we can do to help Ukraine in its noble defence, I think the British people are more than happy to make a sacrifice to do that because it's such an obvious thing to do.
Final point, then. How worried are you, as an objective analyst on these matters, of how bloody it is going, literally and metaphorically, going to get in the southeast, Donbass, and around that area, round to Crimea?
Well, it's deeply concerning. Obviously, the Russians are going to be focusing all their force on this area. The first thing to note is, of course, their supply chain is much shorter there, so they're not going to have the same sort of logistical problems they had up in the north and to an extent in the south. Equally, the sheer volume of force they're amassing suggests that they intend to steamroller their way through, and that literally in the Russian case means kill everything in sight. So we are concerned, obviously. We're concerned for the Ukrainian defenders, and of course we're concerned for the civilians who are going to get in the way of that assault and who the Russians have no care or consideration over and will kill in their path. So it's a deeply concerning situation, which is why we have to supply Ukraine with as much material as possible in this interim period to make sure it can resist this aggression as best it can.
Alan Mendoza, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's Dr. Alan Mendoza, co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society think tank. While that conversation was drawing to a clear and logical conclusion, joining me now in the studio came in a very good old friend of mine, former advisor to Boris Johnson and editor of Conservative Home, Tim Montgomery, is in the house. I'm going to be brutal. And
you're always direct, Alistair.
He's going to get away with it.
I'm not so sure. My phone's been buzzing this afternoon, and on an afternoon like this, I would expect, my normal political colleagues to be contacting me. I don't know what kind of feedback you're getting from your viewers today, but my cousin's been in touch. My next door neighbour's been in touch. A friend from church has been in touch. People who aren't normally involved in political stories. We've heard it all before, Alistair. People who made enormous sacrifices during the COVID period, who obeyed the rules themselves, are furious.
Laura.
Now, I think people in West...
I want Laura to come in on that. Because
but I think people in West...
People have been kind enough to be with us from the top will know that rings a bell with someone sitting right next to you.
People in Westminster, I think, have got used to this story. Yeah. I think people out there haven't. But, sorry, I should let you...
I agree with that. Of course people should be outraged. There were women who gave birth alone without a partner. There were tiny family funerals. People couldn't attend the funerals of loved ones. People couldn't go to worship. Children couldn't go to school for about half the year. These are outrageous impositions on basic human rights. I think the thing that really grates for me, and I don't know if it'll be the same for everyone, is that when they were having parties at Downing Street, it showed that they didn't feel the same fear that they conveyed upon the British public. Yeah. We were told we were at risk, but also the risk. Yeah. They didn't feel they were at risk from each other over cheese and wine. So I do think that it's correct and understandable that people are outraged. I personally don't feel like the fine adds anything extra to the story. No. That's the thing.
Back to the grubby stuff.
It adds due process, I think, just because the police have now investigated it. There's no, because one of the dimensions to this, sorry, Alistair, one of the dimensions of this, of course, is that for a long time, even up until this point, the Prime Minister has denied that he did anything wrong.
Yes.
Well, we've now had the police confirm that he clearly did do something wrong, and I agree with you, the fine in itself is not particularly
we are
material.
Balanced in these matters. That's precisely Andrew Rayner's point for Labour, is that he has lost his defence. The answer to your earlier question is, I would say that at the moment, genuinely, it's about 3-1, storm in a teacup, that he will get away with it, and I've been sharing quite a few of them.
Interesting.
But in a sense, well, no, but your phone calls are important as well, and I know what various members of my family feel about it, and it's very, very strong indeed, particularly the younger ones.
Yeah.
But here's the point. Douglas Ross, who is no mere Conservative, whatever Jacob Rees-Mogg ineptly said of him.
Indeed.
He leads the Tories in Scotland and helped with the recovery up there. And also Andrew Bridgen, who perhaps is a bit more of a usual suspect type. Both have come out and said now is not the time to go for him to go, although Bridgen says maybe a little later. Bridgen doesn't think that Boris Johnson will lead the Conservative Party into the next general election. So the ones that really matter, whether you like it or not, and not your lovely friends phoning you and on the messages that I've been getting and what have you, it is those 300 plus members of the Conservative Party in Parliament, and they're hanging onto the rope at the moment and they're not pulling the lever.
No, and you can say quite legitimately, Alistair, that my position is a slightly tortured position because I would be with them. I don't think the Prime Minister should go just at this moment, but I think his days are now numbered. I do not think you can have the leader of the party that bills itself to the electorate as the party of law and order breaking laws without consequence. I don't think you can have the party leader who clearly misled Parliament. Some will say unknowingly, but I think probably knowingly now we know the nature of the offence that he committed, continuing in office. But, and this is where I get into my tortured position, at the moment, President Zelensky regards the British Prime Minister as his principal ally in Europe, perhaps his principal ally in the world. And do we throw ourselves into a 3-month leadership contest at this time? No, but neither do I think that we can just brush this under the carpet. And so at an earliest opportunity, I would like to see the Prime Minister go. But perhaps just at this moment, it's not that time. I suspect the crunch moment will come after the looming local elections, when I suspect the Tories will get a drubbing, deservedly, and that will be the moment when all this sort of balancing of different factors will come to an end and the Prime Minister will, in my view, have to go. But he will fight to hold on to office, I have no doubt.
Sure.
I think there's a lot more grassroots anger than people think. It's going to sound awfully like I'm name-checking my book, but the Conservative Constituency Associations wrote to me to say that A State of Fear was, by a long mile, their top summer reading list suggestion among Conservative constituencies.
A brilliant book.
Well, thank you so much.
Can you both stay for a while?
I can, yeah.
Brilliant, and we'll come back to it. Because I tell you why, we always promise our GBNews viewers and those who join us on radio that we give them the news on the hour and on the half hour, and my ear is burning because I've been told to move on, so I'm delighted to say to do that. So Tim Montgomery will stay with us, as will Laura Dodsworth, and we'll continue that conversation. And please keep those emails coming in so that I can prove to Mr Montgomery that I'm not telling him porkies either, and that it is about 2-3 to 1 at the moment. So we'll have more of that after the break. I'll also be joined by the Tory Member of Parliament, Adam Holloway, who used to be a TV journalist as well, interestingly. But first, let's bring you right up to date, as promised, with the latest news. Here's Polly.
Alistair, thank you. Well, as you've been hearing, Downing Street says the Prime Minister is going to be fined over his birthday party, which took place in June 2020. The Metropolitan Police saying the lockdown-breaching event took place for an hour in the Cabinet Room at number 10. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the Prime Minister's wife will also receive fines over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. In the United States, police in New York are searching for a gunman who threw smoke bombs and opened fire in a subway carriage, injuring 16 people. Officials saying 10 people were shot in the incident, which happened during the morning rush hour at 36th Street Station in Sunset Park in Brooklyn in New York. The whereabouts of the perpetrator still unclear. And the UK is warning all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims chemical weapons were used in an attack on Mariupol. The city's mayor says the latest estimate is that 21,000 civilians have been killed in the besieged city since the start of the Russian invasion. And in the UK, 3 victims of grooming gangs in Rochdale have received substantial damages and a personal apology from Greater Manchester Police. Chief Constable Stephen Watson apologised for failings when the women were raped and abused by gangs of men as children. Police failed to record crimes, investigate offenders, collect intelligence, or charge or prosecute the abusers. It all happened under previous chief constables, including Sir Peter Fahey and his predecessor. On TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News. Now back to Alistair.
Polly, thank you very much indeed. 25 to 6. I'm with you right up until the top of the hour. I'm delighted to say that my friend Tim Montgomery and also Laura Dodsworth are still here in the studio. We'll be talking to them a little more before we go off air at 6 o'clock. A reminder of that top story. Both the Prime Minister and his Chancellor are to be fined over Downing Street parties. The Metropolitan Police says that officers have made over 50 referrals for fixed penalty notices following COVID breaches in Downing Street and across Whitehall as well. They added that there are large amounts of investigative material from which more referrals could still be made. So watch this space. Joining me now, I'm delighted to say, is Conservative Member of Parliament Adam Holloway, who I mentioned just before that break, who also used to do what I still do for a living way back when, and himself has been out recently to Ukraine to see what's going on there. My question on social media, Adam, was storm in a teacup, or is it the final break point for the Prime Minister? What's your own view?
Well, I'm not known for slavishly parroting the party line, but I think it's extraordinary. It's actually completely mad when even GB News is talking about lockdown parties. I mean, look, if Boris and Carrie had a party where they invited their mates to the flat and so on and so forth, I think we'd be in a very different position. But from what I know, these were so-called events that happened in a workplace. So people think of Downing Street as a sort of Prime Minister's London mansion. That's nonsense. Downing Street has over 300 pass holders. At the time, it was effectively a sort of wartime headquarters where people were very often working outside. So we've got 2 incidents, as far as I know. One, the guy goes outside, idiotically perhaps taking a glass of wine, and goes around thanking staff. And the other one is people wander into the cabinet room, people he works with a birthday cake. I mean, sorry, but these civil servants aren't his mates. They're people who work with him. You've been into Downing Street. You know what the environment there is. So to call this stuff parties, I just think is utterly ridiculous, to be honest with you.
Then intriguing. I'm not going to visit what Angela Rayner said upon what you've just said, Adam, because you're free and always speak your mind. But Angela Rayner says, I don't know if you've heard it or read it yet so far, is that the Prime Minister's defence has gone out of the window. The Metropolitan Police investigators have decided that whatever you think it was, or Tim Montgomery thinks it was, or I think it was, is irrelevant. The authorities that are in charge of making sure that these laws are respected have not been respected. He is in breach. He is fined.
You know, I mean, I just can't take this seriously. It is preposterous. I mean, the media have been telling us that these were parties. As I say, if it was, him inviting his friends, but it wasn't. It was him going outside and thanking civil servants who categorically, many of them actually aren't his mates, as we've seen. Many of them aren't friends of this government. And then, a birthday cake is brought in by work colleagues. I mean, how many nursing stations where those NHS staff were doing such an amazing job during the pandemic, how many of them had birthday cakes and sung happy birthday to staff? Of course they did. I mean, this thing is absolutely preposterous. And I don't know why we're all sort of swallowing it. I mean, it was indeed ghastly for my constituents who couldn't say goodbye to loved ones when they were dying or go to funerals and so on. I get that, but we're really conflating the wrong things. As I say, if Boris had a party with his mates in the flat, that would be a completely different thing. But we're talking about a workplace where they were cheek by jowl, doing 18-hour days or whatever else it was. And I just think this whole thing is crazy and ridiculous. Whether in the context of Ukraine, I mean, even madder. But we're just becoming absurd people that we focus on complete nonsense and we start to believe it. I mean, I've had emails from constituents asking me to assure them that I did not attend any of Boris's lockdown parties. I mean, even the BBC Newsnight ran a piece during the height of this where they spoke about, parties in Downing Street and didn't even point out that Boris was at Chequers. These were workplaces in a very high pressure environment at the time. And this is just crazy.
Yeah. I understand. I didn't want to interrupt it, but I do take that. But I stand by my point that the Metropolitan Police disagree with you and with that analysis. And I'm just being told it's only breaking news, not a crucial or major thing, but Carrie Johnson, the Prime Minister's wife, has apologised for her part in it and has paid the fine. But let me ask you this, Adam, by way of conclusion, if I may. I find it intriguing that the likes of Andrew Bridgen and Douglas Ross have decided that, like you perhaps, that they don't think now is the time for the Prime Minister to go. We should move on and focus on other matters. And yet not one other member of the Cabinet has come out and said anything approaching what you've just said, i.e. storm in a teacup, let's get on, there are bigger fish to fry and more important things to do. Why is the rest of the Cabinet so stum?
Well, look, don't get me wrong. It wouldn't be a storm in a teacup if these guys had a party. But I just don't think that's what you saw here. I say again, this was with civil servants who aren't their mates. I can't speak for the rest of the cabinet, but it just points to a wider problem we have in this country now that people don't actually we've stopped speaking the truth. And we need to start getting a little bit of perspective on things and start to, the media very much included in this, but the politicians too, actually being honest about things and allowing freedom of speech and so on. At the moment, we just don't have it. We have the orthodoxy. People are terrified of going against what the media have told them about, all these parties. Let's go back to first principles. I mean, it's crazy.
All right, Adam Holloway, genuinely always a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for finding time for us. And do keep in touch. Lovely to talk to you as and when you want to. As I said earlier on, Laura and Tim are sitting in the studio. I thought your head was going to fall off at one stage. I mean, you profoundly disagree with, I guess, the bulk of what Adam has just said.
The fact is that we, as members of the general public, don't know the full story about these parties. And what I think Adam is relying on is that fact. What we do have is partial accounts. So we know for certain, certainly the events have been investigated. Suitcases of alcohol were carried in to Downing Street. We don't know what the true nature of the parties were for which the Prime Minister has been fined, because the Downing Street has never really levelled with us. If we'd had a full account, which we'll only probably get when the Gray report...
Well, and they say they've got a lot more evidence, exactly. And we've got the Sue Gray full report yet to come. And
so Adam is partly, I respect Adam, but he's partly hiding behind the fact that at the moment we have a massive information disadvantage as members of the public.
No, I agree with that.
And what we do know, you made absolutely the right point, Alistair, to him. The Metropolitan Police have investigated this, and they have found... The Metropolitan Police going to fine a Prime Minister is not a small thing. No. They won't have done this lightly. They obviously thought there were grounds for the fine.
OK, Robert says, I don't see why the Prime Minister should go. In my opinion, it's no different to getting a speeding fine. Would Labour demand a resignation for that? It's a nothing issue.
I think if the government had introduced speeding fines and then broken them, it would have been different. And that's, I think, why that parallel doesn't quite work. These were rules that this government introduced in emergency and said that we all had to abide by them and then didn't abide by them themselves. Then didn't tell the whole truth to Parliament about it, and then spun it out again and again and again. And we aren't at the end of the process yet. So just saying that this is like a speeding fine, I don't think washes.
Andy says Boris should have known better. He was in hospital with COVID. At that time, I was following the rules. I protected my mum by sitting in her little garden and speaking to her through her window while she was inside 2 metres away. Andy has a vote. Robert has a vote. That's what really matters.
You know, I have to just take issue with something he said as well, though. I mean, the word parties is being used as shorthand, in a sense, for any sort of gathering or breach of the social distancing rules. And he was trying to pass it off as, well, it's a workplace, therefore, you know, it's preposterous to criticise it. How many workplaces were shut? What about the fitness, leisure and hospitality industries? They are workplaces. I think the fact that civil servants are the Prime Minister's friends is neither here nor there. You know, we'd have all loved to be in workplaces with our friends, attending work. My work went out the window. I wasn't allowed to leave my house.
Yeah. We're going to go down to Downing Street and join Darren in just 2 seconds. But final point to you on that subject, listening to Adam, as he said, like you, I mean, no great strong track record of being a flag-waving Boris supporter, and both speaking from the heart and from the brain as well. But it does strike me as a professionally objective, independent observer of these matters, that if the best line of defence is that nothing was done that was wrong and warranted a fine, despite what the Metropolitan Police judgment is, that's tricky.
Yeah, and look, I say all of this, by the way, with enormous sadness. Yeah. I wanted Boris as Prime Minister. I campaigned for Boris to be Prime Minister. The fact that he has been such a disappointing Prime Minister gives me no credit or joy at all. I'm profoundly sad. But you can be absolutely sure that the Conservative Party, if it had been the Labour Party had been found guilty by the Metropolitan Police of offences, would have been unforgiving. Yeah. And rightly so, because if the police have investigated lawmakers and found them wanting, that is a very serious offence. And the Conservative Party has a duty to the country to show that when you break the law, it has consequences. And at the moment, we're still getting a lot of evasion from the Conservative Party. That is not a good place for the party of law and order to be.
Yeah. Laura, final thought on that.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm going to come back to my point at the beginning, which is that we criminalised human behaviour. It was very easy for people to break the rules when what they think they're doing is something so innocent. And this is probably what's happened to thousands of people all around the country.
But final stab, if you'd be so kind, on my point, that if that's the best defence that the Conservatives, as a political party seeking to remain in office, have, i.e. that no offence was committed when the Metropolitan Police clearly have decided that it was, that looks like incredibly thin ice to me.
They've used the wrong line there.
Yeah, they're going to have to come up with a better one than that.
Yeah, they are. Perhaps they're going to have to replay the
Our timing, as always, is perfect. Tim and Laura, utterly brilliant. Thank you both very much indeed. If we have time, I'll come back. We've got 13 minutes, I think, still to go on the programme. And bearing in mind what we were just talking about and Adam Holliday was talking about and what so many of you have been emailing about, if party, who really cares about a cake when there's a war on? Boris is still the best Prime Minister since Winston Churchill, says Lauren. Well, my next guest is not a political commentator, but I'm delighted to say that he is a QC of some considerable renown. Geoffrey Robertson, great to see you, human rights barrister.
Yes.
And you believe I'm being briefed in my ear that the Prime Minister's only option now is to contest the fine if he is to survive.
Well, it also answers the questions that Tim and Adam have put in the last few minutes. This decision is by a policeman, a copper. It's not been approved by the CPS, let alone by the DPP, and Boris Johnson has told Parliament that he's innocent. What's his course? His proper course of action seems to me not to pay the fine and to appeal to a court, to a proper judge. If he does that, we will find out what went on, and the judge will decide whether the police have been acting reasonably and proportionately in fining him. So I think that has been slightly undercut by Carrie's announcement, his wife's announcement that she's going to pay the fine and apologise. But I think in view of the backstory that he's been telling Parliament, he should properly refuse to pay the fine and go to court, because then we will find out. It may be that the judge will take Adam's point and actually acquit him. It may be that we will find out more details of irresponsible behaviour, but the public will at least be able to decide. So that, I think, would be the best course. It would buy him some time so he can go back to Ukraine or whatever, but it would nonetheless be far more satisfactory than having a police force, which is one of the most incompetent in the advanced world. Think of how many mistakes it made in the course of Operation Midland to decide this important matter. It should be a judge, a proper judge.
Right, I want to cut butting because we've only got about 3 minutes left, I think, Geoffrey. And I want to stick to jurisprudence, which you are an absolute expert in, although I know you have very deeply and profoundly held political views as well. But just focusing on the jurisprudence, if one, and some of my viewers have been saying, oh, it's no worse than a speeding fine. Even on a speeding fine, you either tick the box that says, yeah, it was me, sorry, bang to rights, the camera caught me on the M3 or whatever it might be, or no, it jolly well wasn't, and I'm going to contest it. And indeed, in the world of politics, there have been one or two very celebrated cases of that. Just take 30 seconds to a minute, Geoffrey, and take me through what happens. If Boris Johnson, and he'll take legal advice, he'll take political advice and all the rest of it, decides, no, that's what he's going to do. Who hears it? Are we talking about a magistrate? We're talking about a high court? What's the process?
We're talking about, we're talking about a judge at first instance and then possibly the high court. But it's not like a traffic fine, although we treat it like one, because it's got a £10,000 maximum fine. You don't get that for parking on double yellows. And it might be £20. The police haven't condescended to tell us, and the Prime Minister certainly should, how much he's been fined. That's for a start. But then it goes to court and he can call Adam, he can present Adam's argument and say that it's outside the regulations which have never been tested. Yeah. And so it will be an important test case.
It then shifts it back to that vital territory, which is the burden of proof then rests on the Metropolitan Police to say, here's why we fined you £20 or £20,000.
It does. They've got no burden of proof. They've come up with their own view, and that view is very often proved to be wrong in court. So it's a very different case, and it's something, I think, that the public believes in open justice. We talk about open justice. Instead of doing all this in secret, and the police have been have been secretive so far, it was Downing Street itself which fessed up. So that's been a disgraceful aspect of it so far. But it should be open, it should be, and the police should prove their case, just as they have to do in any other criminal court.
Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining us, and what an intriguing development. One of the top QCs in the country saying, here's a cunning plan for you, Prime Minister, contest it, and then say, right, prove it. Thank you very much indeed. Great to see you as always. 30 seconds on that. I mean, that absolute bombshell from someone who genuinely knows what they're talking about. A QC saying, go on, then prove it.
Yeah, I think though, as Geoffrey Johnson himself admitted though, with Carrie Johnson having paid the fine, if actually the fine that the Prime Minister's been levied on the Prime Minister is the same party that his wife attended, kind of the ground's been cut, taken from underneath him, I think. So, but we haven't got the full information. Which party was the Prime Minister fined for, which was his wife fined.
But it wouldn't be the strongest of arguments from the Met to say, well, no, you're the judge to hear, you're guilty as judge because your Mrs. fessed up and paid.
But she hasn't helped.
It struck me that the key point that Geoffrey was making there, that's why I kept using the clumsy word jurisprudence, but meaning, i.e. the theory, the law of court proceedings and the rest of it. He has that right to demand to know why you found. And you were the point, you made the point 20 minutes or so back, saying, look, it's not just something that's silly. This was a breach of what at the time, rightly or wrongly, was the law of the land. Prime Minister should take a deep breath and say, prove it.
You should be the judge with all this pointing, Alistair. But
I'm sorry, terrible habit of mine.
I think the danger, though, of the Prime Minister pursuing that approach, and I see the point that you're making, is that he already looks evasive. He's kept saying he hasn't broken the rules. and then we've now had the Met investigate. It's as if he kicks it into the long grass again. Does he look like he really is trying to behave differently than expected?
No more pointing, I promise. I've got 90 seconds and I'm going to fall off air. So, no, I've got to go back to Darren McCaffrey, who is still in danger. But promise me you'll come and do this again. I'm doing it again next week. Enormous gratitude this end to Laura Dodsworth for being with me and with you from start to finish, and Tim Montgomery popping in about half an hour ago, and most grateful for their thoughts and their considered opinions. There's also the question of whether there is a constitutional crisis now that the country's top 2 elected officials have been handed those fixed penalty notices, and one of the top QCs of the country inviting the Prime Minister to contest it. Final thought, live from Downing Street, our political editor, Darren McCaffrey.
I think my final thought, Alistair, in all of this, having listened to you talking to Tim and to Adam and others, is that this is Adam's argument that this is just merely a birthday party, a surprise one that should be for the Prime Minister, is a pretty strong one if there was nothing else. And all we know in this, Alistair, is that this potentially is only the beginning, that the police have handed out fines to 2 parties they've looked into, the one before the death of the Duke of Edinburgh and this surprise birthday bash, but there are allegations that there could be over 12 more parties to investigate, of which the Prime Minister said to be at some. And the fear, I think, inside Downing Street is this is not the beginning of the end, this is only the end of the beginning.
Thank you for your service and information throughout the afternoon. That's it from us. Thank you so much for joining us. Next up, Jubes and Company. But first, let's leave you with an update on the weather.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It's been turning into a cold and damp afternoon across some northern parts of the UK. Warmer further south, but even here some heavy downpours have started. Now, the weather at the moment is unsettled because low pressures to the southwest of the UK. That's been sending bands of rain and showers northwards during the last couple of days. That continues through the rest of Tuesday. It's also been sending some warmth with it, but that warmth yet to reach parts of Scotland, Northern England, Northern Ireland, where persistent rain has set in. It's feeling cold out there.